I just reread the Twilight series, and today I'm going to give you an analysis of Twilight and Stephanie Meyer using a Mormon/ex-Mormon lens. As you can see from this meme, the Twilight books may be literally the most famous thing ever produced by a Mormon. The books have sold 160 million copies worldwide, and the blockbuster films produced based off the books grossed about $3.3 billion. I think the only person who could compete with this level of fame is probably Ryan Gosling. I haven't revisited the Twilight series since I was a teenage girl myself, and I have to say, reading it as an ex-Mormon adult, I noticed so many Mormon overtones that I added to my outline. They were just jumping out at me from the page, and so we have a lot to get into in this video. This is kind of a part 2 of my video, Why There Are So Many Famous Mormon Authors, so consider checking that video out after you finish this one. Of course, I'm obviously not the first person to draw this connection. There are a ton of fan theories that revolve around Stephanie Meyer as a Mormon and how that impacted her writing. This is my favorite one that we're going to get into, which is essentially that the character of Carlisle is a parallel to Joseph Smith, and that the Cullens themselves represent the one true church, the Mormon church. This analysis will focus mostly on book 1, though I am going to draw from all of the books because there's so many story elements that reek of Mormonism in my opinion, so I'll be drawing on all the story elements. I'll probably be reading mostly quotes from the first book though. And in case you're wondering, yes, Stephanie Meyer is Mormon. From everything I can tell on the internet, she's still Mormon, though she is not super active about her personal life online. Stephanie Meyer studied English at Brigham Young University, which is the Mormon university where I studied and also got an English degree. She has a temple marriage, and she got married to her husband after dating him for 9 months. And growing up, she was one of 6 kids, and she had a stay-at-home mom. What's more is that before Stephanie Meyer wrote the Twilight series, she had never published a single book. No novels before Twilight ever existed for her. She was also a stay-at-home mom living in Phoenix, and she was the mom of 3 boys. So really, almost every single aspect of her life up to writing these Twilight books was a very typical and common Mormon story. And I think her life really changed overnight with the shocking success of these books. She even said in an interview that she, quote, "Unconsciously, I put a lot of my basic beliefs into the story. Free agency is a big theme, as is sacrifice." And in a separate interview, she declared that the Book of Mormon was the book with the most significant impact on her life. Yeah, I mean, she's obviously very Mormon, and she even said that she's put her basic beliefs into this book. And so it's not crazy to analyze Twilight from this point of view, because she literally said that her basic beliefs are in the book. I do think it's interesting she chose to use the word unconsciously there, because as an ex-Mormon myself, I can definitely certify that when you are this Mormon as Stephanie Meyer is, it's basically everything about you. It really permeates the fabric of your entire being, of every thought process, which is why leaving the church is so difficult. And so often when I was reading the book, I think that a lot of the fairly stereotypical ways in which she presents some of the characters can feel quite baked in Mormonism in a kind of unexamined way. I found this speech that Stephanie Meyer gave at Brigham Young University, and the reason it was interesting is that it's actually kind of hard to find Stephanie Meyer talking much about Mormonism in recent years. And so most of what we have about the connection between Twilight and Mormonism is from interviews she gave early on into her writing career. And so that's why this specific video interview was so interesting to me, because it's one of the few instances you can find Stephanie Meyer, a Mormon, speaking to other Mormons at Brigham Young University. This is the portion I thought was the most interesting.
Because I can't tell this story everywhere. People don't always understand it. I started out with a dream that I had, and it sounds a little odd to say that you were inspired to write a vampire novel.
And so I think it's really interesting that she first says that she can't express this to other people, that only Mormons are going to really understand what it means to wake up from a dream feeling inspired or prompted to do something. And the word inspired within this context is very Mormon coded. Anytime a Mormon says, I was inspired to X, Y, or Z, they're specifically saying that God prompted them or moved them to do a certain thing. So you might say, I was inspired to check on my friend, and then they were having a hard time, or I was inspired to write this book. And so I think Whether it's the quotes about how she loves the Book of Mormon, or how unconsciously she put a lot of her basic beliefs into the book, or even saying that she was prompted by the Holy Ghost to write the book to begin with, I think everything about the construction of this book, and basically everything I can find out about Stephanie Meyer, is very, very based in Mormon belief. To give a preview on the major themes I'll be covering, we're going to get more into the theory about how the Cullens are Mormons and humans are Gentiles, and how turning to become a vampire is representative of the resurrection in Mormonism and receiving a perfect body. I'll compare and contrast Bella and Edward as foils for each other, and how Bella is the fallen, imperfect person, the natural man, and how Edward is perfected. I'll also share a little bit about my theory as to why Mormon female writers typically write romances, and Mormon male writers, dudes, typically write world-building fantasy. We also have to talk about the nature of how their romance takes form, how infatuation is shown as love, the gender roles, the age gaps, the power imbalances, and of course, purity and abstinence. We'll also get into how in Mormonism, the Book of Mormon basically gives a false narrative for the origin story of the Native Americans, and Twilight literally does the same thing and says, this is the true origin story of this Native American tribe. And finally, I'll talk about how Mormon culture makes its way into the book, whether it's Bella fantasizing about Hawaii or refusing to drink coffee, her wanting to drink Coke instead, which is just also so Mormon. And so we're going to get into all of that in this video. Just a quick reminder before we continue, don't forget to brew up your own devil's bean juice. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel. I also have a separate Patreon video where I reacted to some of the cringiest parts from the movie, so consider checking out my Patreon after finishing this video. Also, if I could get a brief shout out in the chat for my new setup, I spent the last couple weeks setting up my bookcase and my lighting, and so I'm very excited and feeling very cozy over here, so thank you for your patience while I got everything just right. So the first theme I wanted to jump into is the Cullens as Mormons, Carlisle as Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church, and humans as Gentiles. And I saw this fan theory kicking around the internet. I'd heard of it before, but I'd never really read the books analyzing from this point of view. I did a video titled Signs That Twilight Was Written by a Mormon, and this was one of the top comments, so I had to just keep going down this rabbit hole because I had never somehow heard of this theory before. And the more I thought about it, the more parallels I was able to draw, and I do think it's a legitimate analysis to say that Twilight is an extended metaphor for Mormons and non-Mormons. So essentially the basis of this theory is that Mormons believe they are the one true church, and everyone else are Gentiles, they're not saved, they're not members, and Mormons even will call themselves a peculiar people. When I was Mormon, we would refer to ourselves as elect, and everyone else is in more or less of a fallen state because they haven't accepted the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so if we draw that over to the Cullens, we have an eternal vampire family who are doing vampirism the right way. So they're not drinking blood from humans. Instead, they are, in the book, using animal blood as they call themselves vegetarian. So they're basically a peculiar people, an elect people who are living the true version of being vampires. And Carlisle, as Joseph Smith, literally even tries to convince other vampires he meets to join his version of being a vampire because it is the right way to be. While the other members of the Cullen family have struggled with being vegetarian at certain points and drank the blood of humans, Carlisle never even killed a single human. He was vegetarian from the very get-go. So that really sets him up as the most virtuous of all of the Cullens. He also has this way of just stepping in as the leader consistently. He's the patriarch, he's the father figure, even though Edward is smart and all of the rest of the vampires definitely know their stuff and they are talented, everyone by default looks at him as the leader of the group. And so I think it's clear, even as you can see, as I've been showing in the screenshot, they made the character of Carlisle in the movies look strikingly similar to Joseph Smith. Carlisle also tries to convince the Volturi to come over to his side of being a vegetarian vampire and is very missionary minded in that way. And I think that if humans are Gentiles, so the natural man, the fallen people, the non-elect, then I think that the Volturi could represent the Catholic Church in Mormonism, which I learned was the Whore of Babylon, because it is basically the untrue church. It's the church that leads away the elect and confuses them. So while we have Carlisle in America, which is another Mormon element because Joseph Smith was founding an American religion based on American values, while Carlisle has his one true church in America, the Volturi are the evil Whore of Babylon leading the other vampires astray in Europe. Obviously, also, vampires live forever, and within Mormonism, there's a huge obsession about eternal families and living forever as a perfected being and becoming even better after you've been transfigured. I think that the transformation between human to vampire is also super interesting to me because it mirrors the Mormon doctrine of resurrection. And when I was growing up, I was taught that when you're resurrected, you get a perfect body. So a common joke is if a guy is going bald, he'll say, well, in the resurrection, I'll have a full head of hair again. But unfortunately, this doctrine also can take a very dark turn because this perfected version of yourself is often used as a way to manipulate people. So most commonly in the modern church, gay people are taught that it is a trial they face in this life and that they'll be cured of it in the next life during the resurrection. And they'll wake up and suddenly they'll be straight. And so it's almost like a way to convince them to be celibate in this life because then they have the promise that in the next life they'll finally get to be happy. Like I said, very dark, very manipulative. A way this was also used in the past, which I talked about in my Racist History of the Mormon Church video, is that Black people who were members of the church were taught that during the resurrection, they'll receive perfected bodies, right? So they were taught that their skin would literally turn white in the resurrection. And there's quotes from Joseph Smith saying this and from Brigham Young and other early church leaders. What I found crazy about researching Stephanie Meyer's version of vampires is that she also teaches in the illustrated guide, which she wrote, and I quote, "When the venom spreads," so this is when people are turned into vampires, "when the venom spreads, it also leaches pigment in the skin. So after the transformation is complete, the vampire loses nearly all its skin color. Regardless of the original ethnicity, a vampire's skin will be exceptionally pale." So we have this process in which humans get turned to vampires and become perfect, just like in Mormon doctrine and the resurrection. We also have Stephanie Meyer literally writing into the lore that if a Black person gets turned into a vampire and receives their perfect body, they will become white. This is additionally backed up by the fact that she was seemingly resistant to Black people being cast as vampires in the books. She said, "I wrote that they had this pale, glistening skin." And this obsession with whiteness really mirrors Mormonism's own obsession with whiteness. In the Book of Mormon, for example, it says that Black skin is a curse, and that as people accept the gospel of Jesus Christ, their skin turns white. Mormon leaders also said that as Native Americans were accepting the gospel, their skin was turning white. Another verse in the Book of Mormon said that those who accept the gospel will be white and delightsome. And so to me, this obsession with being pale, or rather just simply being white, is very racist, and it's very Mormon to me. And I think, additionally, vampires are fictional. She's writing a book about a mystical fictional character, and the obsession with adhering to this nebulous list of rules she's written for these fictional characters is strange. It's quite odd to me. The final parallel I wrote down for this theme that the Cullens represent the one true church is the character of Bella. To me, Bella is the golden investigator, which I've talked about in my videos about being a missionary. And a golden investigator is a person who's ultra receptive to becoming Mormon. So typically a golden investigator meets the missionaries, prays about the Book of Mormon, immediately feels that it is true and asks to get baptized ASAP. You know, typically when you teach someone about the Mormon church, they're like, no coffee? That doesn't sound like it's for me. But there are occasionally people who are just very receptive and open to becoming Mormon. And to me, Bella is that in the book. So one example is that all the other people in Forks, all the kids at the high school think the Cullens are weird, or think negatively about them, or think they're strange, or stuck up. Whereas Bella is really interested in them. So, oh, they seem different. They seem like a peculiar people. And she's very receptive to Edward talking to her and to ultimately becoming a vampire. There's a common joke in Mormonism where Mormons try to, I think, seem quite happy all the time and very smiley. Turn that front upside down. There's a lot of stuff online about how Mormons are always smiling. And to me, this is the same as the vampires, where Bella, in a kind of strange way, is able to pick out things about the vampires that are different, that somehow illogically no one else seems to notice. So she can tell when Edward's eyes change, and he's like, wow, you're so observant. And it's like his eyes are literally coal black, and then they're the color of sparkling amber, and somehow she's the only one that notices that, which doesn't make any sense. But I think that also confirms her as a golden investigator, because she's more receptive, she's more perceptive of this difference. And then eventually when she finally gets turned into a vampire, she takes to it like a fish in water, and it's like she's coming home again. And I think that that just represents that the character of Bella is especially primed, that Stephanie Meyer wrote her as ready to be elect, ready to get resurrected, ready to accept the gospel, and that the rest of the people in Forks are Gentiles, and they're not ready to accept the gospel. They're just basic sinners, whereas Bella is ultra ready to come into her own as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Hopefully this is making sense. I think this also appears in her friendships. She's really not a very good friend to her human friends or even her parents. She is pretty disinterested in what they have to say. She zones out half the time. She's like, why is this person babbling on? Whereas when she's talking to any of the Cullens, whether it's Alice or Edward or whoever, it's like they're just meant to be together. They're meant to be friends or meant to be romantic partners. And so I think that it also shows that Bella was always meant to be a vampire, in that she is primed and ready to accept vampirism. And I think, to me, Stephanie Meyer wrote Bella to be a fallen person who is learning to become more righteous. Before we continue, there's one scene from the movie I wanted to reenact. I know what you are. Say it. Out loud. Say it. An ex-Mormon. So I think it's also important to note the absolute mania that was around these books. I remember it quite distinctly. Similar to Harry Potter, midnight releases, dressing up as the characters, and the movies just made it all the more popular. I personally never loved these books, and so I hope that in my analysis I am not ruining a deeply beloved book for anyone. And I saw a lot of articles basically insinuating that people's inability to support Stephanie Meyer's work was anti-feminist. And that's kind of a common take, which is any version of women criticizing women is showing that they don't support women in general. I just reject that idea. I think that the idea that you can't criticize another woman simply because she's a woman is, in a way, misogynistic, because it puts women on this pedestal to say that they are perfect angels, when I actually think there's a lot more dignity in engaging with the work in a critical and thoughtful way, rather than just saying, oh, women wrote, women good, work good. And there's obviously a distinct difference between ridiculing someone or calling them names versus critiquing or criticizing their work in a thoughtful way. Ultimately, I think that engaging in thoughtful criticism is actually much more humanizing to women than to just say we should support all women, literally no matter what they say. The next theme I wanted to highlight is the idea that Bella and Edward are foils for each other. And this basically just means how they compare and contrast with each other to highlight the specific differences between the two characters. On the one hand, we have Bella, who is quiet, submissive, bookish, clumsy, and then on the other hand we have Edward, who is athletic, beautiful, well-spoken, and basically perfect. And I think this is in part a continuation of the idea that the Cullens are Mormon. We're just going to look more closely at Edward's character. He's strong, he's authoritative, and he's living in a perfected state, just like Mormons will believe they will after the resurrection. Bella really is the stereotypical damsel in distress. We also see Stephanie Meyer start the Twilight series with a verse from Genesis. The verse that she starts off with is, "But of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." Genesis 2:17. And I think that Bella is kind of set up as an Eve character. Stephanie Meyer also at one point is like, he didn't know me from Eve. That Bella thinks that. Many people have remarked that she's a fairly one-dimensional character. I actually think after she has her baby, she becomes more interesting, which to me also parallels the Mormon woman experience, which is that until you're married and have children, the rest of your life is more or less put on hold because you need, those are your divine callings in life. So until you reach those two things as a woman, I feel like a lot of the world is just in a blur because you're meant to complete this mission in your life before you can move on to the rest of it. So as I was rereading the Twilight series, I thought it was quite interesting that once we see Bella get married and have her baby, then her character takes on a much more three-dimensional point of view. She has actual things she starts to do outside of pursuing her romantic attachment or having the children. And so to me, that just felt quite Mormon. Bella is also very book smart. She loves to read. She does not like math, just like every girl out there, apparently. She also arrives in Forks thinking that she's going to be left out and kind of a strange outcast, but the opposite really happens, and I think the reason why Bella's character always bothered me so much, even as a young teenager, is that she's really just not a good friend. She's constantly saying that she hopes that she gets to get accepted, and then the way she writes about her human friends is like she's so dismissive of them and so unwilling to just be a good friend. They invite her to do things and she rolls her eyes. They're talking to her and she zones out. And to me, this also felt very reminiscent of female relationships in Mormonism. I think that one sure sign of a very patriarchal and misogynistic culture is that women hate other women. Because in patriarchal and misogynistic cultures, women are inferior. Women are clumsy. Women are meant to be doing the cooking and raising the children. And men are always the first class versus second class citizens. And so I think that when you have a lot of internalized misogyny, you also view other women as inferior. So you would think that the women might band together more often, but I think that we see this, for example, in Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. They're really not developing a really strong sisterhood. They are instead turning on each other, and they're more likely to criticize each other than the system they're in. I think you can only go so long in a culture like Mormonism, which is teaching that women are less important than men, in my opinion. And at a certain point, you just start to internalize it, that even women think that women are less than men. And so I think that Bella, in how Bella treats her female friends, that she doesn't show up for them, that she's very willing to disregard their friendship or to see them as pawns to use as a way to get closer to Edward, felt like a common Mormon dynamic to me. I also think that Stephanie Meyer's portrayal of Bella's love interest outside of Edward, her human love interest, was very Mormon. The kind of puppy dog behavior of Mike and Eric, how they're asking her on dates, they're walking her to class, and Bella's reaction to it, because Bella really doesn't say no. Let's read an example from the book. "So," Mike said, looking at the floor, "Jessica asked me to the spring dance." "That's great," I made my voice bright and enthusiastic. "You'll have a lot of fun with Jessica." "Well," he floundered as he examined my smile, clearly not happy with my response. I told her I had to think about it. "Why would you do that?" I let my disapproval color my tone, though I was relieved he hadn't given her an absolute no. We skipped ahead. "I was wondering if you might be planning to ask me." I paused for a moment, hating the wave of guilt that swept through me. "Mike, I think you should tell her yes," I said. And this dynamic between Bella and the human boys that are interested in her happens again and again, where she truly will not tell them no. She'll just push them off a little bit. She'll say, "Well, why don't you ask this other girl?" Or "I'm busy because I'm going out for that weekend." Or she comes up with all of these excuses without ever being able to just say no, in a way that seems quite odd in the book from my new ex-Mormon brain. But my Mormon brain was like, this is totally normal to not say no to boys, because as a Mormon girl, you're really discouraged from saying no. There's a lot of little handouts about this. At church dances, we were expressly told that we should never say no to a first dance, because if the boy did the hard thing of asking you, you can do the hard thing of dancing with him. And later in Eclipse, when Jacob kisses Bella, it's also worth going back to read that story, because to me, that was exactly the experience of a Mormon girl being kissed and feeling like she can't say no. When I was listening to that scene with Jacob and Bella, I was like, oh, this feels so religiously coded to me, because I think as a girl, when boys act in this way, you're definitely programmed to more or less not say no. You've been taught your whole life that saying no is rude, to be sweet, to be kind, to be welcoming, to not ruffle any feathers. Even when Bella is then kissed by a boy, we see the same behavior manifest. And I actually felt like this is a very dark part of the book, seeing Bella have all of these instances with young men where she's just not saying no, and she's beating around the bush and trying to consider their feelings more than her. Because that was my experience with dating as a young Mormon girl, is that I was always trying to please the other person and never willing to stand up for myself. We also have this instance with Tyler. "I'm sorry, Tyler, I'm stuck behind Cullen." "Oh, I know, I wanted to ask you something while we're trapped here." "Will you ask me to the spring dance?" he continued. "I'm not going to be in town, Tyler." He says, "That's cool, we still have prom." And then later we find out that Tyler has been telling everyone that she's going to go to prom with him. And I think that this behavior of her really struggling to say no and to stand up for herself still carries over even further into her relationship with Edward. She has this gut sense that Edward seemingly is always right about most things. There's a scene where he's driving and he's going 100 miles an hour, and when he laughs off her concern that they're driving too fast, you never really get a lot of resolution to feel like her concern was heard. There's another scene where he's driving quite closely behind her after she leaves visiting Jacob, and he's edging up his car to be as close to her as possible from behind, and she seems like she thinks that protectiveness is love, and that him watching her while she sleeps is a sign of true love. And I do think it would be disturbing to have one of your children, one of your daughters, reading this book and seeing how Edward is a very possessive boyfriend in a very destructive and abusive, I would say abusive way, but have it held up as, he's calling me 500 times because that's how much he loves me. When really this is quite alarming behavior for a boy to have towards a girl. Let's look at Edward's character now. Edward's values are true Mormon values. So Edward values chastity, for example. He doesn't want to kill humans. He wants to be a vegetarian. He even says that he's sad that he'll never have children, that he'll never die. He wants to have eternal progression. So Mormons believe they will literally become like God someday. And part of that progression is being able to die and go to the afterlife. You can see a chart here of the Mormon afterlife. But in the highest level of the celestial kingdom, Mormons believe in eternal progression. And so part of that eternal progression is becoming God yourself. In so many of the traits Edward exhibits, he's basically showing that he has the desire to become perfected and to become a God himself in a way that very much parallels Mormon theology. He also denies himself the natural man, which is another scripture that gets tossed around a lot in Mormon circles. He doesn't drink blood. He also denies himself a carnal relationship with Bella, and he's very willing to put off his natural urges in order to be more virtuous. Whereas Bella, as the foil, wants to have sex. She's a fallen character, and I think it's so interesting that once Bella becomes a vampire, she starts to recognize these higher laws that Edward is so obsessed with. Stephanie Meyer was asked if she read 50 Shades of Grey, which was basically a Twilight fanfiction, and she said, "It's so not my genre. Erotica is not something I read. I don't even read romance," which is kind of funny because this is a romance. "It's too smutty. There's a reason my books have a lot of innocence. That's the sort of world I live in." And I think obviously that's what made the Twilight books so perfect for teenagers, is that they had this clean element. I think that's why a lot of Mormon media is perfect for, it's very Disneyfied, it's very clean, it's very family friendly, and I think that's one of the reasons it was so successful. And even when Stephanie Meyer does have the wedding night scene, there's not a lot of details given. It's basically a fade to black, and I think it reminds me of, I had a religious friend growing up who, she would listen to rap, and she wasn't Mormon, but I remember asking her why you're allowed to listen to these lyrics, because a lot of them are very sexy. And she said that she told herself that all the people in the lyrics were married, and so they weren't breaking the law of chastity, so it was completely fine for her to listen to the music. And so to me, I think it's very funny that Stephanie Meyer will only illustrate this sex scene after we know that they've been married. And of course, Bella is very young when they get married. Speaking of 50 Shades of Grey, Stephanie Meyer also said, "To me, true love is that you would hurt yourself before you would hurt your partner. You would do anything to make them happy, even at your own expense. There's nothing selfish about true love." And I honestly think that that explanation of love is quite inaccurate. I think the idea that you would do anything to make them happy even at your own expense sounds quite self-destructive. I actually disagree that if you are willing to constantly serve yourself up on the platter of like, "I'll literally do anything you want because I love you," sounds like a recipe for disaster. And I think we often see Bella sacrificing herself for those around her in a very destructive way. Whenever we see Edward on the page, we see a lot of Edward commanding Bella what to do and saying how things are gonna go, and Bella being quite submissive and willing to obey what he says to do. I think often this is written as if Edward is just quite protective of Bella, and he is willing to do whatever it takes to make sure she's safe. But this often takes the form of him controlling her and telling her what to do. To me, this is a very common gendered dynamic within all religion, but especially in my experience in Mormonism, where the man is literally the head of the family and the woman is subservient or secondary to the man. You can see I wrote in my journal that in my relationship, I wrote this as an adult, that I basically am saying that the man will be the head of the family, but somehow we'll still be equals, and that's a goal I have, that in my dream list of what I want a man to be, I'm writing down that he's gonna be the head of the family and the patriarch. I think Stephanie Meyer is writing that a man that's controlling and protective is love, because that's just how much he cares about you. But I do not think that that's a good example for teenage girls, for them to be thinking that this is the best way for a boy to show he loves you. I found this Reddit thread where this person said, "Her job wasn't to make role models, it was to make a story that people would read." And a lot of times when people criticize Twilight, I think Twilight fans are quite resistant to the criticism, understandably, when you're a fan of anything. But to me, If this was a book for adults and marketed toward adults, I would have a quite different feeling about it. But any time that something is meant for teenagers and is marketed as young adult fiction or YA literature, the standard just has to be a little higher because teenagers are still children. They're not adults yet. And so for me, I don't think I'd have this as a book that I'd want my teenage daughters to read because I don't think I'd want them to internalize a lot of the messages about chastity, purity, the anti-abortion messages, the possessive men as true love message, the girls as one-dimensional, romance-yearning females. Really, there's just a lot in the book that I find to be not the best example for young girls. This is a great moment to transition to talking a little bit more about the elements of chastity and purity in the book. We have Edward, who is a 100-year-old vampire who has somehow never had sex, and he's a virgin. And in the book, he's like, I'm old-fashioned, and I always wanted to wait until it was the right person. And this really needs no explanation as to how this is very Mormon. Chastity is a huge element of Mormonism, and especially for Mormon teenagers. I think this is also, to some extent, that this book is kind of abstinence porn because it really romanticizes this idea that when you are going to find your eternal soulmate or your true companion, that you should save yourself and you should be pure so that you're ready for them as the right person. And that really only having one partner in your entire life is the perfect example of how a person should be. I can't understand the perspective of why this element of the story worked so well for young girls. I think that this idea that Edward wants Bella not for her body, but for her mind, is very romantic. And I can understand fantasizing about a boy that loves you for you and your personality and everything about you versus just wanting to get with you. And that's, it's not surprising that the book did well as far as that element of the romance. I think that when it's paired with all of these ultra possessive behaviors and paired with this idea that it's like chastity or bust, that purity is the ultimate goal to strive for, and that anything else is definitely subpar. I also think this abstinence made it so that the books could have this really slow burn relationship that is very common in love stories where, I mean, especially in older literature, you see people flirt, like just looking at each other to flirt with each other for 300 pages of the book. It's like, I saw him across the vegetables at the market for 3 seconds, and then like you have 10 chapters about that. So this is a very common literary element within romances written for women. I think a lot of female Mormon writers use this slow burn love story to really up the ante for the audience, where it's like this painstaking slow walk toward the romantic relationship, and it's like you're waiting for something to finally happen between the two of them. It reminds me of the dynamic between boys and girls in Mormon missions. So an 18-year-old goes on his mission, and then he has a girl who is not serving a mission who is waiting for him. So often you'll hear young girls say something like, I'm not dating right now because I'm waiting for my missionary. And when I was at BYU, there were whole Facebook groups dedicated to girls supporting other girls while their boyfriends were on 2-year missions, and they were saving themselves and refusing to date anyone in the name of waiting for their special chosen soulmate. And of course, in the book, we see that Edward has them getting married as a prerequisite for sex. And the whole book is really just charged with this purity and virtue message that I can see why a lot of people were hesitant to say this is just a great book for young teenagers. And on top of the themes of chastity and virtue, we obviously have these age gap relationships, of which there are many in the book. A not so fun fact is that when Joseph Smith secretly married his youngest bride, Helen Mar Kimball, she was 14 and he was 38 or 39. And so obviously, big age gaps in relationships between the man and the woman are quite common within Mormon history and within the church. So another common dynamic is that Mormon men go on missions, and then when they come back, often they will date youngest, like the freshman girls. So if I meet a Mormon couple, typically the age gap is almost always 2 years. So the man is 2 years older than the girl. And this is problematic because often it means that the girl has just graduated. She's in her first year of college, and the man has spent 2 years, often in a foreign country, learning a different language. He's much more experienced with the world, and the girl has received the message for her entire life that the man knows more than she does, that he's the patriarch, that he has the priesthood, that he should lead the relationship, and that he will be the head of the family if they were to get married. And so this dynamic really creates a power differential in a Mormon relationship that I see all the time. The most obvious age gap relationship is Bella and Edward. Bella is 17 when she meets Edward, and he was turned into a vampire when he was 17, but he's been 17 for like 90 to 100 years. So obviously there's a huge maturity age gap here that the audience is meant to be comfortable with. Also, just the idea that vampires would want to be in a high school at all when they're literal immortal beings and they're showing up for PE class and to take their math homework home. The story has a few holes, obviously. We also have Jacob and Renesmee. Jacob imprints on her as a baby. He's a full-grown adult. And us as the audience. This also happens with Quill and Claire when she's 2. Quill imprints on Claire. And it's very disturbing to read it because Bella at first is like, this seems wrong. And the audience is also like, this seems wrong. But then she slowly comes around to it. And I'll put it here, but I saw a video of a girl comparing that to Emma's reaction to polygamy. When Joseph Smith first revealed it to her, she was like, I disagree with this. And then as time goes on, she kind of begrudgingly finally is like, okay, you can do that, I guess, because I can't divorce you or don't want to or whatever. I also feel like reading the book of where they're imprinting on the babies, it really feels like, why did she have to write that in there? That feels a little bit also like the black skin turning white thing. Like, why did you have to put that in there? Even within the realm of vampires and this strange romance, even within the context of the already strange book, it feels like a huge red flag being waved around, where Stephanie Meyer just chooses to write this element in where the werewolf is like, I will have a romantic relationship someday with this baby. And all of us in the audience are just like, can you just not put that in there? Like, it's not important to the plot. I mean, I guess it is in the sense that Jacob needs to care for Renesmee once she's born, but there's a lot of other ways we could have had that be an element of the story without preordaining them to be romantic partners as the baby is exiting Bella's womb. Well, I guess she didn't actually exit Bella's womb. She more like jumped from her abdomen. I also think on the topic of imprinting, this is very Mormon. Mormons believe, here we are at the Mormon before life and afterlife. Mormons believe in the premortal realm. And in the premortal realm, pre-earth life, basically our souls lived with God. And part of the lore is that our souls probably went to find our soulmates and made promises to find that soulmate in the afterlife. So according to this lore, my husband's name is Jackson. My soul in the pre-earth life went to find Jackson and said, hey, I'll see you on earth. And then we'll get together and we'll get married. And then when we're at BYU and I see him for the first time, it's like, wow, I feel like I knew you in another life. And that's part of Mormon doctrine. And so I feel like this idea of imprinting feels like this pre-earth life soulmates part of Mormon doctrine, because it's almost like you can't even fight against it, because in your other life you already made this decision, and so in this life you just have to go along with this urge that, and guys will sometimes use this at BYU to be like, I feel like I knew you in the pre-earth life, and I feel like we're meant to be together, and I just got a revelation that we're supposed to be married. And if a girl is very susceptible to having priesthood leaders tell her what to do, she may just go with it on the basis that her religion has confirmed to her that men can receive these types of revelations. As far as age gap relationships go in the book, we also have a 17-year-old Bella flirting with a 15-year-old Jacob, which also was just kind of, to me, a bit of an unnecessary age gap. Really, all of the age gaps, when you read it, it's like, she could have made him the same age. I mean, she could have... This feels a little unnecessary. She also could have just made them all in college, but then the book wouldn't have been able to be marketed as easily toward a high school crowd. But that's another element where Jacob is 15 and she's 17, and she kind of flirts her way into getting him to tell her information in a way that feels quite icky. Another theme in the book that we need to discuss is how Stephanie Meyer writes an origin story for the Native American tribe, which is Jacob's tribe that is in the book. So obviously she presents this real origin story, which comes from this werewolf folklore that Jacob tells Bella. Wouldn't you know it, in the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith wrote the true origin of Native Americans. And that's how we get the Book of Mormon. We have the Nephites, the Lamanites, that a man in Jerusalem came on a boat all the way to the Americas, and that is the record of the Book of Mormon. And so to me, another parallel between Twilight and the Mormon Church or Mormon doctrine is this willingness to just say, I know the true origin of Native Americans. I mean, Mormons also have done this with Polynesian people. I've talked about that in other YouTube videos. And Mormons are quite comfortable with just saying whether it's Hawaii or the Philippines or the Polynesian Islands. There's lots of instances of Mormons just saying, hey, I know your true origin story, and let me just let you know where you actually came from. I think also reading through the first book again, I saw a lot of elements of Mormon culture coming into play. We have the soda scene where Edward orders them some Cokes and Bella says she doesn't drink coffee, and she's like slurping down the Coke super fast and then her heart's going crazy. And Mormons love either Coke or Diet Coke, take your pick. I also think it was funny in this quote that Bella is like fantasizing about Hawaii. And if you know Mormons, you know that all of them want to live in Hawaii. Every Mormon influencer seems to have a phase where they go live in Hawaii for a while. I also just thought it was funny that she makes Bella be from Phoenix, Arizona. Stephanie Meyer was raised in Phoenix, and then she was living in Phoenix when she wrote the Twilight books. And Phoenix is a very Mormon, really all of Arizona has a lot of Mormons. It's Arizona, Idaho, Utah, that whole area is pretty Mormonified. And so the fact that she's placing Bella's hometown as her own, Stephanie Meyer's own hometown, which is also a Mormon hometown, I just thought was kind of funny. We also have the khaki skirt scene, which I'm assuming I may even have comments about already, because when I made that Signs Twilight was written by a Mormon video, one of the top comments was also like, what about that scene where Edward is like thirsting over Bella wearing a long khaki skirt? So I figured I'd read that section. I ended up in my only skirt, long, khaki colored, still casual. I put on a dark blue blouse he'd once complimented. A quick glance in the mirror told me my hair was entirely impossible, so I pulled it back into a ponytail. Okay, I bounced down the stairs. I'm decent. He was waiting at the foot of the stairs, closer than I thought, and I bounced right into him. He studied me, holding me a careful distance away for a few seconds before suddenly pulling me closer. Wrong again, he murmured in my ear. You are utterly indecent. No one should look so tempting. It's not fair. And so I think that the fact that when I was researching for this book, I saw a lot of people making little pictures of what that outfit probably looked like. And I think the idea that Edward is really wanting her when she's wearing I'm picturing like a basically to her feet khaki skirt, which I've almost never seen in real life. She's just dressed very modestly, but he's like, you're so indecent, which is the definition of modest is hottest, a common Mormon phrase. I haven't mentioned it yet, but this should have probably gone earlier, which is that There's also just an overtone of blonde being pretty, which is also very Mormon. I know I've said that a lot, but I thought it was funny that she writes that the hostess at the restaurant where they go is unnaturally blonde, like being a fake blonde is like a capital offense. And then a lot of the Cullens are blonde. Because whiteness and blondness and blue-eyedness is preferable to Stephanie Meyer, not to me. And thus concludes my analysis of Twilight using a Mormon/ex-Mormon lens. I hope you enjoyed it. If you found any other parallels, please feel free to drop them in the comments. As I said, I made a Patreon video reacting to some of the cringiest parts of Twilight, the movies, so consider checking that out if you want to keep the party going over there. It's already posted. Thank you so much. I can't do it. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and as always, I will see you all next week.